Hi everyone, this is Rosa Spinola, and we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm here with Evan Sutton. We'll be your co-trainers. Next slide. So a little bit about myself and why I'm training on digital tactics for direct action. I started organizing 12 years ago. It's before like Tinder existed and before peer-to-peer texting was a thing, and when digital was really new. And I first organized with Majority Women, Majority People of Color Collective, and we forced our university to publicly divest $15 million from a company with hotel rights violations, and 9 schools followed and workers won a union. And I was really curious about how we can make digital actions put pressure on the decision maker to give us what we want. And so one of the tactics that we were using back then was faxes. So nowadays you might send lots and lots of emails to the decision maker, but back then we were sending lots and lots of faxes and filling the university president's office just with faxes. And that's all her intern could do all day was deal with the faxes. So that's how I got started using digital tactics for direct action. And I'll hand it over to Evan to introduce himself.
Hi folks, my name is Evan Sutton, and like Rose, I've been doing this work since it was called New Media. It's really quite amazing to think over the years when I was first starting in this space, there were still United States Senate candidates who didn't understand why they needed a website. And just for perspective, that was as recently as 10 years ago. So things change very quickly. In terms of the direct action side of things, the first time that I was able to actually apply a direct action was in a campaign when anti-union activist Campbell Brown was trying to launch a big publicity campaign against teacher tenure, and we were able to run a campaign to disrupt her rollout, and we were effective enough that the backers of that particular campaign actually completely revamped their entire press strategy around it. And it just gave me a really great taste for how things can go when you're ready to just go for any amount of disruption you can generate. And I'm excited to share some of what we've learned and honed over the years with you here.
Cool. So logistics, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat box, name, pronouns, org, and what you're hoping to learn. We also want to let folks know that this session is being recorded. We want to ask that if you have questions, on the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a button that says Q&A, that you click on that and you submit your question. That way we can keep track of what we've answered so far and what still needs to be answered. And then the last thing is to drop any tech challenges in the chat, and our room host, Tiffany, will try to help you out. And Tiffany also introduced herself in the chat and shared the guidelines for Netroots Nation. So goals. In this session, we're gonna learn to choose a target in demand, develop digital tactics to win our demand, and build our base at the same time. So power is the ability to make your decision maker give you what you want. So maybe it's hazard pay, so higher pay rates during COVID. I'm curious, what is something that you want your decision maker to give you? Either a campaign you're working on right now, or maybe something you've worked on in the past. And you can go ahead and write in the chat box. So what is something that you want your decision maker to give you? Go ahead and add that in the chat box. Workplace protections for COVID. Someone, Shane wrote in the box. Thanks, well, keep it coming. Oh, now we're getting responses. So Mitch Mary said, we would like Jay Inslee to replace his director of Fish and Wildlife and revise wolf management policies. Dustin said they're trying to get their police department defunded. Martin's with a group that's trying to stop evictions. Kalila is trying to get hazard pay for home care workers in several California counties. Statewide COVID policies from the Oklahoma governor. This is awesome. So this session is going to be really helpful for you all. We're going to talk about how direct action is fundamentally about disruption. So we must make it impossible for our target, so whether that's the Oklahoma governor, or whether that's Jay Inslee, or whether it's the person who can stop evictions in your county, how do we make it impossible for them to go about business as usual? And we also want to increase pressure on our target over time, which we're going to dig into as we go through this training.
So for the first example of a recent direct action that you all may recognize, if you think back, I don't know, what was this, 2 months ago, when our friends in the White House were promoting their first big in-person rally since everything shut down in Tulsa. And then campaign manager Brad Parscale and of course, Cheeto Benito were promoting every day these skyrocketing numbers. All of these people who are registering, we're going to have the biggest crowd. And you remember they built a second stage outside for the overflow crowd, and were right up until the last minute promoting 1 million people were registering for this. And then 6,000 or so people showed up. Now, there was a lot of churn for a second about where did everybody go? And then all of a sudden, all of these young people on the internet, K-pop fans and TikTok teens were saying, hey, check out what we've been doing. And it turned out that they had been registering. Now, the degree to which they may or may not have affected the turnout to this event is unknown, but what they most certainly did is they fed into their target's greatest weakness, which is the vanity of the campaign. And the desire to make everything look bigger than it could possibly be. Any real data person would have looked at the numbers coming in and gone, there's something fishy here. We probably shouldn't promote the idea that 500,000 people are going to show up for this rally in Tulsa. But it was just too juicy for this team. And the disruption that this caused was that for the better part of the next week, nightly news and internet commentators were leading with what went wrong for the Trump campaign, followed by Trump campaign gets punked by kids on the internet. And it made it impossible for them to even pivot away. It was a micro action in the grand scheme of things, but a really effective way to really go for the weakness of your opponent and make them disrupt them in a way that they can't avoid dealing with. Now, that was not really a direct action that was probably planned using a framework, but one of the things that we've found useful over the years is honing this framework, and this is built from a variety of different organizing philosophies to really fit the internet specifically. And so when you're sitting down with a team to think about an action and thinking, are we going to try to use a direct action? Actually go through this framework, and the slides are going to be available after. You can sign up to receive them via email so that you'll have this on hand. But the first thing I want you to do is think about, what is my problem? You have to start with why you're doing something in the first place. So clear problem, something bad is happening in the world. The second thing I want you to think about is, who is the audience online who you're going to activate to be part of this? And I want you to be as specific as you can be in this, and we're going to show some examples as we move forward in the slides of really thinking about who are the people that I'm going to try to activate. If you think back to the TikTok example, you've got teenagers largely activating each other and younger people on the platform who are activating each other and their followers on the platform, engaging in an action that is like fun and funny, which fits with the way that the platform is largely used. We're going to ask those people to join the fight either alongside of or on behalf of our frontline communities. So we're going to need to be very specific about who our frontline community is, and that's going to fit back to our problem statement. The next thing that you're going to lay out is the big demand that you're trying to achieve. So defunding a police department, we heard earlier, that's a big demand to achieve. Replacing or getting statewide COVID restrictions, that's a big demand. And you're going to want to have a big demand in mind that fits right in and that people could visualize how that could change their lives. The next question that you're going to ask yourself is, who is my target? I have to put pressure on a single individual in most of these cases. In some cases, and Rose is going to talk about this, you might have a secondary target or a very small group decision maker. But if you're thinking beyond a very small handful of people, then you're thinking too broad, especially for direct action. Direct action needs to put pinpoint pressure directly on the person who eventually can make that decision. The next thing that you're going to think about is, what are we asking the target to give us in this moment? So to get, for example, to that demand on defunding the police department, you may be, for example, pressuring a city council member in this moment to introduce a city budget that does just that, right? There's steps that you have to take along the way. And for a direct action, as opposed to a whole campaign, right? A direct action is just going to be one component of a campaign typically, but your direct action should be moving you to the next step in that campaign. We're going to do our best to set a deadline. Deadlines are important both so that they give us something to build toward and so that we can put clear punctuation marks at points in our campaign. Even if you have to make one up, figure out what's my deadline and then roll with it. And only once you've gone through all of the rest of this am I going to ask you to start thinking about your tactics. Usually, if you're doing a digital training, you throw out, people will just start throwing out, I'm gonna do a petition, I'm gonna do letters to Congress, I'm gonna do faxes, I'm gonna do tweets. But what your tactics are going to depend entirely on getting to, are going to depend entirely on the previous question. So line those out before you start thinking about how you're going to go about it. So if we're thinking about this framework, this is not a direct action statement. We are organizing people online to speak out against high stakes testing in the United States. That doesn't give us a clear framework that we can build any kind of plan from. However, and this is an actual campaign from my time at the American Federation of Teachers, this is a direct action framework. Because Pearson is the largest high stakes testing company in the world, and they have received negative publicity for gag orders related to their tests, we are activating educators and parents to end high stakes testing by pressuring Pearson's board of directors, our secondary target, to force the CEO, our primary target, to take a meeting that they have been refusing. We will do it by flooding their inboxes with emails from allies during their annual shareholder meeting on April 25th, while also leafleting attendees in person. So this lays out very carefully all of those components of that framework. And it gets us to what are the tactics, right? We've identified our opportunity and now we can apply tactics. So here's just a quick picture. This was a really fun campaign to be a part of. This is then AFT's chief of staff actually handing out flyers to shareholders at the Pearson shareholder meeting in London. At the same time that we've got this Move On petition platform triggering an email every time somebody signs. And in the course of a 2-hour meeting, we triggered 10,000 emails to flood their inboxes. Their Blackberries were blowing up as they're sitting on the stage in front of their shareholders. And we got the meeting, right? Our short-term ask that we were trying to get to was get that meeting with the CEO. Through this action, we were actually able to get them to move to that.
Thanks, Evan. So at the beginning, when I introduced myself, I talked about one of the very first campaigns I learned to organize on. And it was this campaign where we forced our university to publicly divest $15 million from a hotel company with workers' rights violations. And we publicly committed not to invest anymore and to divest. And workers want a union. And if we go to the next slide, it lays out how we approached our digital tactics. We said because hotel workers experience high injury rates and low wages, we are activating students to join the fight with hotel workers, to win card check neutrality, which labor folks, I'm sure know what I'm talking about, but card check neutrality basically just makes it a more just process for workers to unionize, and that we're pressuring the CEO of HEI hotels to meet with workers. And we did this by flooding the CEO's email inbox and fax machine, and by picketing outside their hotels. So we used a mix of online and offline tactics, and even things like flooding a fax machine or phone lines, I think are somewhat hybrid, or also make the case for like that in today's world, there aren't really digital actions anymore and field actions. We just have organizing actions. Next slide. And I think that's you, Evan.
That is me. And I'll just jump off of what Rose said there, just to say that the best thing that digital can do for you is make it seem to your targets that you're much larger than you could mobilize in person. Because we can mobilize people anywhere, and we can do it in ways that generally require very little of people. But at the same time, you are going to almost always need to have a small group of people who can do something in person just to reinforce that demand, the way that they had picketers outside for the action Rose described, or that we had those two people in the room leafleting shareholders. Without those two people in the room, our emails could much more easily have been ignored. So whenever you're using an online action to pressure your target to do your demand, really just a reminder, and we heard this earlier, right? I've seen all these online petitions, they don't go anywhere. If the tactic that you're choosing isn't actively putting pressure on your target, you're never going to get to that demand. So really thinking about, what way is this tactic going to make it impossible for my target to go on with business as usual? And we're going to talk about now, how do you choose that demand and then focus in on your target. So this is quick. Again, you're going to have two demands. You have the big demand and the little demand. But if we had gone to folks and said, we want you to sign this petition to demand that the Pearson CEO have a meeting with union leadership and teachers, it's not a very inspiring demand, because people are like, well, what the heck is that going to do? But if you start with that demand that's going to make a real impact in people's lives, we want to end high stakes testing. Now, if you think back to 2014, when high stakes testing was the be all end all of education policy in the United States, teachers were mad, students were stressed out, parents were frustrated, people wanted it gone, at least in the way that it was being used. And so that's a real impact in someone's life. Or increased wages, that's a real impact in someone's life. So make sure that that big demand is something that people could see and feel in their imagination. And when you can see and feel that in your imagination, then you'll know you've chosen a good demand.
So let's talk about targets. The target is the person who can give you what you want. It's not a committee, because the CEO of a company is not like sitting in a circle all kumbaya with like his co-CEOs making a decision. They like to tell us that to stall us. And to make us believe like, oh, we'll have a decision in 2 months. Just wait 2 months. Give me a plus sign in the chat box if that's ever happened to you. Also, if we're thinking about our legislators, it's not like the corporate Dems are sitting around in a circle and they're like, what should we do? Like, no, actually, we need to figure out who are the people who are on the fence or who we can flip, and we need to run a campaign against every single one of them. So when I worked on the campaign to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP, it was a bad trade deal that really benefited corporations and was going to cause a lot of damage to people and to the planet. And we sat down and we figured out what are about 20 legislators who we can get on our side, but they're not currently. And we then went and ran a campaign against all 20 of those legislators, and we were able to flip enough of them that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was never able to pass. And Evan, is there anything you want to add here? Okay. So we might also have secondary targets, and that's if your target isn't well known, you might choose to pressure a more well-known secondary target. And if your target isn't responding, you might put pressure on people who can pressure your target for you. So an example that I use is I always think back to that first campaign, the hotel worker rising campaign that I worked on. And we weren't sure if the decision maker was the executive vice president of finance or the chief investment officer. Sounds like they do the same thing to me, but their roles apparently are different. And so we weren't sure who our target is, so we just went to the chief investment officer's office, and we had a sit-in, but we called it a wait-in, so that folks would feel more comfortable about participating. And and so we waited, and we said, we'll just wait until we can meet with you. And eventually they come out and tell us, actually, the chief investment officer isn't the decision maker. It's the executive vice president. So sometimes you got to poke around. And then sometimes you just might not be getting through to your target. So if you're targeting a boss to get hazard pay during COVID, who are some people you could go to? You could go to their barber. You could go to their priest. You could go to their mistress, their wife, their neighbor. Who are some other people who might be able to pressure the boss? Go ahead and write that in the chat box.
And I think, while folks are adding their thoughts on here, this is one of the places where this kind of work can get really interesting and fun. And I think Rose is going to share an example in a second of ratcheting up pressure through a secondary target. But if you can get those secondary targets on your side, or just make things so annoying for them that they tell somebody to knock it off and give those annoying people what they need, so I can go back to my lattes. It's great to break through that secondary target.
Thanks, Evan.
Albert drops in your boss's favorite news program, which I think is just a wonderful one. If you can get their news program talking about them or the issue, it's such a powerful tool.
Yeah, and I'll give an example when we start to talk about pressure. I think on next up is opportunities and resources.
So while folks are plugging that in, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to identify where and when to target. So if you're thinking about what kind of deadlines to set, right, or where to build direct actions into a campaign, the first thing I want you to think about is just where are there things that are going to happen in the world anyway. Again, with corporations, a shareholder meeting or a time when they're going to release an earnings report are predictable things that happen every year. A publicly traded corporation has to do a report to shareholders, right? In the government space, obviously elections or legislative cycles are going to be key inflection points. But there's also things like the 4th of July or Christmas, right? Where there's external things that happen that we can see, like, is there an opportunity to build an action around this? There's also going to be your rapid response moments where a crisis pops, there's a piece of news that you didn't expect, you find out, hey, your target is going on a TV show and you think maybe you can pressure the host. Any number of those things where you may not have a lot of time to respond, but you need to be ready to mobilize if you get an opportunity. And then the third one is you just make something up, right? I'm going to create a moment. I'm going to set a deadline. I'm going to make up a day, and we're going to turn this into a thing on this given day. And then the final thing, as you're kind of weighing through this before you start getting into tactical applications, is thinking about who you can mobilize and when, and thinking about it in terms of what's going to take you the least work to get people mobilized. If you are trying to go from nothing to a 10,000 person rally, you're going to have an awfully hard time most of the time. But if you're building consistently over time and you're thinking about it in terms of what can I do easily right now, you're going to have a much easier time.
And we want to increase pressure over time. So there's 3 key ways that we do this. And Evan's going to talk about the first way.
Great. So the first way is simply increasing the frequency of your actions. Again, this is going to be online and offline. And another example from my time with the American Federation of Teachers, when Betsy DeVos was nominated as the Secretary of Education at the end of 2016 and into her confirmation hearings in 2017, we started out our campaign with a very broad petition that was really just laying out, asking people to sign on to our principles for public education. Then we went to a letter campaign, sending emails, letters, and postcards to members of Congress to oppose her. Then as the hearings ramped up, we went to tweet storms asking members of Congress to ask her very specific questions about her philosophy. We went in a more offline fashion with this print ad. You may have a local newspaper where you can buy, a front page of the daily for a very low cost. Even in Washington, D.C., this front page was about $5,000 to run for the day, which is like less than a week's worth of Facebook advertising going to Mark Zuckerberg. We also ratcheted up with in-person activities like protests, both in D.C. and outside of senators' offices all around the country. And then by the end of this cycle, we were doing daily digital actions of some sort, just to make sure that the staffers and the senators were not able to open their computers, turn on the TV, walk outside their offices without somebody saying to them, Betsy DeVos is unqualified.
You can also increase the number of people at actions, either online or offline. And so one example is last time, maybe your legislator received 5,000 emails. Well, this time, make sure they get 10,000. And then the last example is heightened tone. So when I was working on the campaign to stop the TPP, there was a member of Congress who wouldn't come out against the TPP initially, and he was Presbyterian. So we got a Presbyterian pastor from his area to talk to him, and he still wouldn't come out against the TPP. So she wrote an op-ed in the local paper. And something you could even think about doing is once you get that op-ed published online, using digital advertising to ensure that your congressman sees it over and over and over. And again, if you have questions that are coming up, please put them into the Q&A. And you can also be responding to things in the chat box. Next slide.
So we're going to ask you all now to throw in a couple of digital tactics, if you can think of one or two, that you could use to put pressure on a target. And this would be great if there's a specific target you have in mind, or just generally speaking, things that you have seen or thought about. And as Rose said, feel free to throw questions in as we're thinking about this. And I think while folks are doing that, the example Rose just gave of getting the pastor to first talk to the person directly and then to write an op-ed. Unfortunately, in our legislative sphere these days, shame is not as powerful as it once was. Just another legacy of our current administration. They've realized that if they just do things shamelessly, they often get away with them. But especially in corporate settings or in lower down in the public works spheres, shame is a really powerful tool. People don't like to be shamed, and if you can figure out whose advocacy would actually embarrass a person, it's a really powerful way to move people.
Thanks, Evan. And I see folks already replying. Run online advertising in the decision maker's zip code. Send petitions to the email of the HR people who are on the bargaining table for the workers that are demanding protections. Fundraise for a billboard next to headquarters. And then how could we turn that into digital action, the billboard?
I mean, I think anytime that you've got real world content, there's a variety of ways, right? Like you could ask people to come by and take a selfie of themselves with that billboard and post it. You can just run your own social media campaigns with it. You know, the degree to which there's any kind of line left, as you were saying earlier, Rose, between real world and digital sphere, especially as people spend 5, 6, 7 hours a day on their phones or at a computer, you know, with social media blinking next to them, you know, it ceases to be a separate entity, and you're just figuring out how can we integrate it in a fun way.
Yeah. Noelle suggested newspapers or letters to the editor in the social feed of the decision maker. Tweet storm, hashtag takeovers, geo-targeted ads. Thank you, Angela. Can someone explain what the clickbait tactic is? A couple of people have brought that up. Taking over the comment section on a live stream press conference. Yes, definitely. Putting a text message call to action on the keyword to send someone a link to their phone for them to email, call, or tweet. So having people email, call, tweet. Praise a rival company over and over. And I want to share perhaps my favorite tactic. That said, I am not a lawyer and I am not your lawyer. So you should check with lawyers when you are trying different tactics. But when I was working on the campaign to stop the TPP, we knew which members of Congress managed their own social media, their own Twitter accounts in particular. And you might be wondering how. And what we did was that we followed them, and we would get an alert every single time they tweeted. And then we were able to figure out, like, this member of Congress posts sweaty selfies, like, as he's jogging. Clearly he's managing this. Like, I don't think an intern is running alongside him and like, Congressman, pause, let me get a picture of you for your social media. And so somebody, I don't know who, created bots, many bots, so that when that Congress member and others who manage their own accounts would tweet, they would get bombarded with responses from bots that effectively turned off their phone. It made their phones inoperable. And so that's probably my favorite digital tactic I've ever heard of. And then I want to shout out that Alana Levin is going to be talking about hashtag takeovers and tweet storms a lot in their training tomorrow at 4 p.m. Details are in the chat box. And then I'm just reading through the other things that have come up.
So we've got some explanations of the clickbait tactic, which I didn't realize this was the name for this tactic, but I have seen it a lot. So this is the tactic where you talk about a trending topic or a clickbaity type of headline, but then you follow it with, and this is your daily reminder, for example, that we need to arrest the cops that killed Breonna Taylor. Thanks, Martin, for that example, and everybody else who helped explain. I never feel older than when somebody has to explain what's going on the internet to me. So jumping forward, I think, Rose, this is continuing to be you.
I want to ask folks, which tactics would you try first? And the idea here is something like bots. Probably doesn't come at the beginning of a campaign or target. The decision maker will not take us seriously. There's also not much for us to escalate in if we're starting off there, right? Like, that's a very heightened tone already. So we might want to start off with something like a call-in day. What are other tactics that you would start off with? In the chat box, which of your tactics would you start off with?
And I will say on this one, this is such a critical thing to think about, like each step, where and how am I going to escalate this? But also just a reminder that sometimes when you have those rapid response opportunities or a crisis hits, you do have to go, zero to rocket launch. And so thinking about, when you have an opportunity to plan actions, thinking about this escalation, and then also being ready with your biggest splash item, just in case something happens where it's important to just throw that grenade and run as fast as you can.
Yeah. Next slide. So what tactics?
Oh, is this me?
It can be either of us.
It could be either of us. So, on this one, we're going to do another tactics share. What can you do that's going to help you grow your membership? So some actions, if you ask people to participate in a tweet storm, for example, you're at least initially starting just with the people who you already have in your network. But what actions can help increase your membership? And also, for example, with a tweet storm, if you have new people tweeting, how can you make sure that you capture them for the future? I think while folks are thinking about that, I've seen several mentions of TikTok, and this is one of the perennial challenges with new social media, is that most of the new social media channels that have been launched in the last 14 years since Twitter went public, 13 years, whatever that's been, many of them don't give you a lot of opportunities to gather any kind of metrics. So TikTok is a great example. People can build these huge followings, but you're not getting much data back. You're not getting many metrics. How can you turn those people into activists that you can count on if you build up a great TikTok stream? Or if you've got a whole lot of folks on your Snapchat, or even interacting with you on Twitter, but not necessarily following you?
I'll give an example. You could ask them to sign a petition. And on that petition, I might only ask for people's email address the first time, maybe first name and email address. And the next time I ask them to sign a petition, I might ask for their phone number too. And then I can call them up with a phone banking tool and be able to track whether they answered the call. And if they said yes, they'll come to an action. Or if they said yes, they will participate in some sort of online action. Maybe we're asking them to run the Zoom for our upcoming car caravan.
Great.
Another way that we could collect data is when we have a webinar and we ask people to log in with their name and email. And I would just say here that when we think about how we're growing our membership while putting pressure on our target, we don't only want to think about increasing our email list from 5,000 people to 60,000 people in 1 year, which I've done. We also want to think about how do we get the people who support us to actually become local organizers and set up meetings with their members of Congress, or set up pickets, or set up socially distanced in-person actions during COVID. And then we also want to think about who we're attracting with our actions. So, for example, I'm really invested in organizing with other young Latinas in Northern Virginia. And so when I'm building out tactics, when I think about who I invite and how I want to build out a tactic, I'm thinking about that. And then question. Yeah. I saw you open that up.
Oh, I jumped to the question slide too soon. And just to build off what you were saying there, Rose, thinking about that growth, both in terms of your raw numbers, but also the capacity of your membership. Do those people have the skills to start a local chapter? Do they have the confidence to run a direct action against a local target themselves? Building out that skill set is such a critical part of growth. And I'll say, one of the, to me, most inspirational new organizations over the last few years is the Sunrise Movement, which has really invested in this model of growing both in scale and capacity. And they've got local chapters all over the country. They're very actively organizing and semi-autonomous in the way that they go about things, but also have this ability to mobilize large numbers nationally and even internationally. And it's clear when you see an organization like that that they're investing both in reaching a wide audience, but then also lifting up and investing in the skills of their immediate folks. I'm sure we've got some questions coming in. I do want to say one last quick thing before we get to those, which is that one of the things that is really important is taking the time to get to know what are the tools that are available. You may work for an organization that's super well funded, and if you do, A, congratulations, and B, like, take advantage of that to get access to tools that can help make some of this work easier. So, one great example is there's a tool called Attentively that lets you track and manage and automate responses on Twitter to a wide swath of people, so you can match it back to your email list. I'm not promoting this tool specifically, but it's just an example. You can match it back to your email list and schedule tweets to go out if someone tweets with a certain hashtag or certain words, where you're tweeting back at them, hey, I see you're, we see you're interested in Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Have you signed our petition to, stop holding that back, right? And ways to like get people off of different social media channels into your streams. There's lots of tools available, and it's worth taking a little time just to kind of keep your eye out for what are the things that are available, what can they do, what would it cost, and always weighing, of course, is it worth it? But knowing what's possible, even if you never use it, is super valuable. And Rose, do we have some fun questions coming in?
Yeah, we have a few questions, and you all should keep on sending them in. So Noelle asked, what's one of the easiest digital tactics to increase newsletter subscription? And I think I have one overarching question for you, Noelle, and then I can offer some tactics. My question is, how are you using the newsletter to put pressure on your target? And there's a lot of answers for that, and we're going to provide this slide deck to everyone who came so that you're able to dig in and think about that. And then I would say that if you want to increase newsletter subscription, which I would actually reframe as just increase the size of your list. There's different science, like for many years, newsletters were less effective than just sending a really brief email asking someone to sign a petition. But newsletters are starting to be opened and clicked on again at higher rates than they were for many years. So anyway, I'm going to repivot to how do you grow an email list? And my answer is you want to be asking people to sign on to petitions, to write letters to your members of Congress. You want to ask them to sign up to volunteer. And so you need to have a demand and a target so that people know why they're getting involved and like how they're going to make a difference. And then Noelle also asked, is it helpful to say we already have 1,200 people who have spoken up? And I would say yes. It's helpful to let people know we only need 100 people left. And that's why you see the tactic used so much online and in person. When I'm trying to get people to come to a rally, I'll say we want 60 people and we already have 55 RSVPs. But that said, direct action is largely about creating a mirage, and that's why it's so effective. Evan was talking about this at the beginning, that you just need to disrupt the person's life and make it impossible for them to go about business as usual. And that's a major difference between electoral campaigning and advocacy or labor campaigning. In electoral politics, you win when you get enough votes. And I've done a lot of electoral organizing, and I'm glad to talk about it. Whereas in advocacy organizing, you win because you make it impossible for your decision maker to go about business as usual. And I think that gets to Stephen's question as well, about what evidence do we have that tactics involving tactics putting pressure on the decision maker work. I mean, I think that it's the foundation of direct action organizing, and it's how I've won a dozen campaigns that have created real improvements in people's lives. Evan, you want to take one of the next questions?
Sure. What do you got?
What was the Twitter tool you mentioned again called?
That particular tool is called Attentively. It's attentive.ly. It was founded by several of our longtime Netroots folks, although they had the good fortune to get bought out. Yay, payday! And I think to that previous question, if I may quickly, with direct actions, one of the things that is going to help you grow via direct action is creating actions that give people that feeling of FOMO in their gut if they weren't part of it. And for the people who in any way were part of it, give them a feeling of elation. Folks, I don't think I'm breaking any kind of news here. Most folks in this country and around the world right now are feeling pretty downtrodden. And when you give folks a taste that they can be, even with a very small action, that they can do something to stick it back to the people who are putting us all in danger or taking advantage and exploiting us, it gives people that desire to keep going and to do the next thing. And for folks who weren't participating, make sure that you promote your successful actions and even your unsuccessful actions. Talk about them, put together roundups, put it in your newsletter, put it out on social media, show people excitement and enthusiasm even when you don't win, so that people who maybe aren't part of your network immediately feel like, oh, that's something that I could help with.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and put up this slide with our contact information, and we can stick around and answer any other questions. So next slide.
Clicking over. And I just want to shout out to Alana in the comments who threw in that so many times when companies come to the bargaining table, the first thing they say is stop being mean to us on the internet. If you're doing any kind of corporate related campaigning, corporations are so sensitive to their online presence, and you can really mess them up just by tweeting at them, by doing negative Yelp reviews, by messing with their Facebook or Google reviews. There are super low bar ways that sometimes we skip past because we're like, who reads the reviews on Facebook? Actually, the corporate PR people read the reviews on Facebook, and then the CEO hears about it and they're afraid that customers read it. And so they'll oftentimes, just as Alana says, be like, they'll give you a lot more than you thought they would just because they don't want you to keep messing up their mentions.
Yeah. I would love to be in touch with folks. I just realized that it's showing up in blue, so it's hard to read. My contact information, I have my Twitter handle, my email, and my website. I work with organizations and put on trainings at the intersection of digital and data and organizing. And I'm going to be hosting some other trainings on intersecting topics like how do we actually move people through a ladder of engagement during COVID. So please email me if you want to get on my email list, or go to my website and sign up for my email list. Evan, how can folks be in touch with you?
So the best ways to be in touch with me are Twitter. I like corporations. I'm very sensitive to my mentions. Or via email, evan@firekitcampaigns.com. And before we wrap up, I do just want to address a question here that I think is really important that Jonas threw into the chat. Jonas asks, what do you do if your most aggressive tactics don't get the desired results? Seeing a lot of fatigue right now. I think there are a lot of answers to this, but one of the most important things is just be honest with people, especially the people who participated. Don't try to put rose-colored glasses on. If you've got some good information to share with people about what was accomplished, to give them some sense that this was not all in vain, that's great. But being honest with people that hey, we didn't get what we wanted. We threw our what we thought was our best shot at the wall. It didn't get us where we want. Let's regroup and figure out what we can do next, and give people the space to not be okay. I think especially in this moment where if you're okay right now, I don't know who you are or what you're doing, but people need the space to not be okay. And when they've put their heart into something, even if it was just that they signed a bunch of petitions and sent some tweets, if it doesn't go their way, it makes a big difference to report back and say, hey, this didn't go our way, and we're looking at our strategies and our tactics, and we're going to come back with something new.
I would also add, for the person who, Jonas, you asked what happens when your most aggressive tactics don't get the desired results. I would say right now on that campaign, I think there's two other things you can do. One is look at who secondary targets are. Two is to pivot your demand, so your demand might change a bit, or you can come up with a new short-term demand. Often that happens when people come up with a long-term demand but don't get their target used to saying yes beforehand, like come to a meeting with us. They say yes, they get used to saying yes. We're able to celebrate as a campaign or an organization. And then I would actually add in a third thing, which is check on your people, right? Like you should be having one-on-ones right now where you're not always asking people to do something. By one-on-one, I mean like a one-on-one conversational check-in. And you should be working with your organizations to make sure that people are getting support that they need in this moment and not just asking them over and over to do stuff. I know we have this room for another 5 minutes. So if there's questions, you can keep on sending them in, and we can also try to answer the 2 questions that are left in the question box. Again, if you want to submit a question, you can use the Q&A button. You can also just write it in the chat box. Evan, Donald asked, localizing action on Facebook is relatively easy. Any tip on localizing action on other platforms?
Not really. Email, hopefully you're gathering people's zip codes as you go along. So email is another one where you can localize, but short of advertising, you have very limited localizing options. Now that being said, to varying degrees, Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, as part of the Facebook family. But if you're doing advertising, typically you can do some pretty localized advertising on any of the platforms. But it's very difficult to generate localized action on other platforms. And I just want to jump back, in the chat, Brendan asked me if shooting first was part of my real life philosophy, because I've got Han shot first in my bio. Direct action is fundamentally about taking initiative away from the other side and putting the other side into the reactive space. The more that we can make our opponents react to what we're doing, the more likely we are to win. If you think about it just like a boxer or anybody else, if your opponent is on their back foot, if you've got them moving away from you, more often than not, when you can set the terms of the debate, you're in the advantaged position. So particularly when you're planning a direct action, but in general with your campaigns, I just strongly encourage you, don't wait around to see what the other side is going to offer or how they're going to set the terms. Set the terms that you want, go for them as hard as you can, and make the other side respond to you.
Thanks, Evan. And there's a question for Martin in the chat box. Martin, just send me an email if you have specific questions about organizing with faith communities or with Presbyterians. And thanks, y'all. Please reach out to me on email, Twitter, go to my website and join my email list. Have a great Thursday.
Happy Netroots Nation at home, everybody.
And thank you to Tiffany, our volunteer.
Yes.
Morning Tech.
And Tiffany, I hope that for volunteering, you got some good use out of the session and it lived up to your hopes and dreams. now we sit here awkwardly for a minute until she kicks us out of the room.